Contested Ground, exposing the strategies and tactics of grey zone warfare as actors compete for power and influence below the threshold of armed conflict.
Well, g'day everyone, it's Liam Garman here, Managing Editor of Defence and National Security here at Momentum Media, the team that brings you the Contested Ground podcast, and of course our Defence Connect and our Defence Connect Spotlight podcasts as well. It's a very, very growing platform we have here at Contested Ground and Defence Connect. And today I do apologise to our listeners because I'm actually releasing this a few weeks late. I'm joined by a very special guest, the author of Gallipoli Soup, A War Story of Statecraft and Sacrifice, Tim Knight. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Liam, for having me on the show.
And originally I was going to organise for us to sit down before Anzac Day, because what better time to discuss Gallipoli than in the lead up of Anzac Day. But actually I booked for us to meet on Easter Monday, which was kind of no bueno, but we're here. We're here and we are discussing your book, Gallipoli Soup. Now, Tim, take me away, because you've got a full-time job. Yes. You've got a lot on your plate. What inspired you to put pen to paper and write this book?
The idea came really after a trip to Turkey when I travelled there with my family. My wife is Turkish. She migrated to Australia with her family when she was 8 years old. And so I grew up through the Australian school system, having to learn about Anzac Day and how the Anzacs were heroes fighting against the enemy of the Turks, who were her people. And we travelled there. We travelled around Turkey, visiting family. We visited Gallipoli for a one-day battlefield tour. It was just really a small part of the trip. I dragged all my kids there. They weren't that interested in it at the time. But when we were there, we looked around the cemeteries, as you do as a battlefield tour at Gallipoli. And my older kids, particularly my daughter who was 8 at the time, she started to question, why did the Australians come to fight in Turkey? With her context of knowing that her mum's from Turkey, her grandparents are Turkish, and a lot of our friends are Turkish people. So just trying to reconcile that with why the Australians came to fight against this country that's on the other side of the world. And I didn't really have a very good answer to her question. I didn't kind of think about it that much more at the time. We were travelling overseas with 5 kids. Youngest was 1 year old. My oldest was 11. So we had our hands full on that trip. We came back home afterwards, and I thought I'd like to research a bit more and really probably come up with a better answer to that question. Now, why did the Australians go and fight in Turkey? So I did a bit of research, read a number of books. I was fortunate to be able to find a number of books that told the story from the Turkish perspective as well as the Australian perspectives. There's certainly a lot of material about the Allied campaign at Gallipoli, and not so much from the Turkish perspective, but there's a few good books that really go into the detail of what it was like for the Turks, and I found that quite fascinating, but also frustrating in some ways, in that the material was what I was looking for. The answers were there. This is kind of why it happened, and there was complex politics around the war and alliances between England and France and Russia and the waterways of the Dardanelles and the importance for shipping access and a whole lot of complex political reasons and the stalemate at the Western Front. And the Allies needing to do something to sort of break out in the war. So there was, I guess, in some ways, a lot of logical reasons why it kind of happened. But it didn't really give me comfort that that I understood what it was like for the people involved and why it really had to happen, and could there have been another way. And I was also found it kind of frustrating that I'd done all this work and I'd sort of learned all these things, and no one else around me seemed to be all that interested in it. And I think these history books can be quite dry to read, and really only someone who's quite motivated is going to go to the effort of reading through and doing that sort of research. I really enjoy reading novels, and I wouldn't generally read a historical textbook for fun. But at the time, I was reading the Game of Thrones novels.
Oh, yeah.
And I found them to be just so interesting to read. And it's a fantasy series about a pretend world and pretend people. But it's history told in a way that is so engaging. It's a fantasy history, but it's so engaging and a fun story to read. And I had this kind of idea that this book should exist, a book that tells the story of Gallipoli from all these different perspectives in a way that reads like a novel, that's sort of fun to read, and it tells the story from not just the Australian point of view, but the Turkish perspective and German and English, who were sort of pulling the strings, is what was happening in the war. And another thing about the Game of Thrones novel that kind of really made me think a bit out of left field is that it tells us a story that's not just a fight between good and evil. There's all these different countries, all these different houses, all trying to do the right thing by themselves, all sort of flawed characters, but trying to do the right thing for their own loyalties, and yet they all end up in these amazing conflicts because they've got, I guess, conflicting objectives. And the real world's like that. War is often like that.
Of course, there's always going to be nuances, and especially when you look at something 30, 80, 100 plus years on, you do have a tendency to oversimplify things. And this might not be the best example, but the immediate example that flashed in my mind was, say, World War II with Finland. And Finland obviously being against the Allies. Now, you can't necessarily condemn the Finns because, well, they were being invaded simultaneously by Soviet Russia. So you have actors that, even though they're on one side, are also exploiting it for their own long-term advantage. So looking at it from that holistic point of view is very interesting. And I know, to your point, when your kids are asking, like, why did we do this? Why are we here? And I know you're and we'll get to this, actually, this is a very important step for the podcast, is it's written in narrative style. And one of your chapters is you have the German diplomat, I think it was a German diplomat, who walks in and he's like kind of looking at the map and he's looking at the Bosphorus and he's like, this is so critically important for the controlling of this very strategic area. So putting an emphasis on that, and then the Allies or the British Empire coming in and say, well, we can't allow that to happen. So to your point, then controlling that mouth was actually quite a critical objective, or was perceived to be a very critical objective. So looking at that, it is written in narrative style where you have different characters that are loosely based on historical figures. The main historical figures, I understand, they're as they are. They're real life senior commanders, politicians are as they are, but the more junior people are loosely based on fact. Can you tell us about the narrative style, that merging of fictionalized accounts? Now, it's obviously not science fiction, but the fictionalized accounts. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, that was something that I kind of agonized over a lot early in the process, because I couldn't find really many other examples of where people had done this, and it sort of made me worry. Well, is there some reason that this is a dangerous approach to tackling history?
I had sorry to cut you off, Tim.
Right.
I remember when I was a kid, and we had this series of history books, and they're very small, maybe 100 pages, but they do go through that fictionalized account. And I think there's that they did have the Anzac soldier, and it was told from a first person perspective of a young recruit. But this is for children, like ages, I wouldn't say anyone over 13 would, to be honest, would be reading these. But it's almost a bit sad that you would have to have a parent kind of encouraging that. It's not really a book that a kid would pick off a shelf. And I mean, do kids even read these days, to be honest? So when you're lamenting the readability of these novels, I think I very much agree with you on that point.
Yeah, so I guess I would say I wanted to really provide a book that tells a story that takes the reader on a journey, and at the end of it, they've got a better sense of what it was like in the trenches and why did it happen? How did they all get there? And not just sort of a simplistic approach to it, but really trying to be as real as possible. And certainly, I would say, some of the content wouldn't be suitable for under 13-year-olds because I tried to make it as real as possible, and a lot of very bad things happen in wars.
So the book is written in a narrative style where you do have fictionalized persons. Where does the fact become fiction, and where does the fiction become fact, and what are those blurred lines?
Sure. Yeah, no, that is something that I did worry a little bit about. There's 17 point of view characters in the book, and some of those are real historical people, like you say, and some of them are fictional characters. So when we're looking at the strategies and the politics, I thought it was important to really look at the real people, people like Winston Churchill, who were quite instrumental in determining the whole approach there. To tell the story in a realistic way, to really give someone a sense of what it was like, I relied very heavily on memoirs and diaries, as well as the sort of the broader history accounts. I chose to make a number of the soldiers as infantry privates, both from the Australian Imperial Force and for the Turkish forces. I chose to make them as fictional characters, but place them in real battalions, real regiments that really existed and really were located on that hill on that day and fought on that trench raid on that day. But that gave me the freedom to rely on memoirs and diaries from multiple different soldiers who were there at Gallipoli, and incorporate their feelings, their emotional responses, and some of the incidents, the mucking around that they did, the horseplay, the response to seeing people getting injured and killed around them, and what that was like. So I needed to draw on, I guess, multiple accounts to try and provide a number of perspectives that the reader could really get a sense of what it was like from both sides.
How did you go about doing that research? Because to get your hands on the memoirs and the diary entries would be very challenging. How did you go about conducting that research, and how did you manage that around your day job?
The research, I guess I treated it as a hobby, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. The whole process of writing the book took me about 7 years.
7 years
from the moment that I had this sort of a crazy idea in my brain that maybe I could write it, to the point where I had a full draft that I could give to someone.
So the young daughters that you went over are now adults?
Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what inspired you about it? With the kids, and asking the question of what led us to being here. It's taken a journey.
Yeah, it has. Yeah. So I treated it as a hobby. I thoroughly enjoyed the process. So that enabled me to do it in my spare time, on the train at night. Sometimes I got up early before work and worked on it for a little while, because I was pretty motivated to do it. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. There were certainly times when I thought, it's such a drag to have a full-time job and be doing this, when I'd just love to focus on this, because I was like really in the zone and enjoying it. But it was also quite freeing in that I'm not relying on this book to put food on the table and support my family. So it meant that I could sort of take as long as I wanted. I didn't have to answer to anybody about a deadline, and I could just say, I'm going to make this as good as I can, and it's going to take as long as it needs to take, and I'm going to make it exactly into the book that I think it should be. So that sort of gave me that freedom to really take that approach and make that a priority. To come back to the other part of your question about how did I go about finding that information, there's quite a bit of material out there with Australian soldiers' memoirs, and in the lead up to the 100-year anniversary, which was the 2015, the State Library of New South Wales, who has a whole lot of old diaries that have been donated, they actually got people to type a lot of those up, and some of those had some very interesting content, very relevant content. Diaries and memoirs I found to be a much better source than letters home, because the letters were very heavily censored.
Yes, of course.
But some of the guys against the rules wrote diaries and went into quite a lot of detail about how they felt, what they were doing, and managed to get these things home. So that they're a really valuable resource. To get that from the Turkish perspective was much more difficult.
Imagine.
There's probably a lot of that stuff written in Turkish that I can't access.
Lucky you have a translator on hand. Can your wife read it?
Well, to a certain extent. I mean, the thing is that the Turkish language in 1915 was written in an Arabic script.
Of course. It was before the Latin alphabet. Was that under Ataturk?
Under Ataturk in the 1920s, they redesigned the whole language and the Latin alphabet.
That's funny. I didn't even consider that. That is a huge roadblock.
Yeah. So
for your
the original maps and things you'll find have got all Arabic script on them, the Turkish maps.
Yeah.
So certainly I can't read those, but there is some material that has been translated into English. There's a diary of a Turkish lieutenant who was at at Lone Pine. And that's been translated, and I found that to be quite helpful and insightful, and in a lot of ways very similar to a lot of the Australian diaries, actually. That there's also a number of good accounts that have been written in English in the last sort of decade or so about the Turkish approach at a strategic level, the Turkish defences, how they took it on, and those have some photographs and some extracts from memoirs and things that talk about what it was like for the guys on the ground. So, yeah, I got hold of whatever I could there, I guess, to try and splice that in and tell the story from the Turkish perspective as well as the Australian perspective, because these guys, they were, the Ottoman Empire was in a state of collapse. They were coming off the back of a number of military defeats in North Africa and in the Balkans, and this was like their last stand to defend their homeland. They knew that they were defending the Dardanelles Strait against the British warships, which was the most powerful navy in the world. They knew that if the warships got through, that the next stop would be Istanbul, and that was the capital. That was the home of the Sultan, their political ruler, their religious ruler. It was everything for them. It was really them defending their homeland.
Even from the Turkish perspective, it was a very existential fight. Their backs were against the wall.
Absolutely, yeah, it certainly was, and they were very committed, and they certainly didn't back down the way that the British predicted that they would. Yeah. And a lot of the soldiers were of the Muslim faith. There had been a jihad called. They were assured if they were killed in this war defending their homeland that they would be straight off to paradise. So they were very, very committed. Yeah. So
I guess I hadn't factored that religious aspect into it. So the Turkey that I expected was probably a post-Ataturk Turkey, post-secularization, but there was that religious element to it. It is funny when you go down to the war memorial, even in Canberra, and there is a Gallipoli section there, and you have images of the Australian soldiers with Crusaders, that they're taking back. They're taking back the Holy Land. So it is interesting how you have those religious aspects tied in. Now it's probably not fair to say the book is fiction, given that it's given that the stories are based off of the diaries that have been anonymized and rolled into the one to create the holistic life of the individual soldiers that you've portrayed in there. But when you were reading through the diary entries and the memoirs, were there any times that you were like, wow, I did not know this, or that is terrible, or I don't know, any if we're looking at the kind of Anzac legend, any larrikin moments, were there any real takeaways from that?
Yeah, look, there's so many things that really surprised me. I mean, the power of the story is in all the true components, really. Where I had to fill the gaps, those parts are much less surprising or dramatic, I think, than the eating
breakfast kind of.
Yeah. The things that really did happen. Sometimes I just thought, wow, how could that be? I mean, one small thing which comes to mind when the Australians waiting to attack Lone Pine and the guys who were in reserve. So the first wave had already gone in, and some of these guys were waiting to join in, and they were sitting up at Brown's Dip, which is fairly close to Lone Pine. They were in the sights of the Turkish artillery, and so the Turkish artillery started lobbing shells on these guys who were waiting there. And one of the diary accounts, which I really found difficult to believe, but he wrote it, so I've included this in my story as well, was that this guy who was waiting there as a reserve, he saw an artillery shell coming towards him, and it landed a couple of meters away as he watched it sail in, and it was a dud. It didn't go off, so it just burrowed into the ground and left a hole that he thought looked like a wombat hole, because he was that was sort of how he saw it. And then another one came and landed even closer, and it also didn't go off. And then there was these two wombat holes right next to within a few meters of where it was sitting. And I just thought, I couldn't make that up. Like, if I made that up, someone would say, you're being unrealistic.
And it could very well be correct, given that when you have a dud round, a lot of it is a production process issue. Or, obviously you'll have you could have the problem of a faulty weapon system, which means it doesn't fire. But the other half of that is, if it doesn't go off, that it could be a production issue in the round or the shell itself. So having two back-to-back actually might be more believable, given that it might have been a systemic production issue in that round of shells. So that's very, very plausible. But you'd count your lucky stars, wouldn't you? Bloody hell.
Yeah.
Any other kind of stories where you're like, yeah, you can't make that up? Or anything that was particularly hard to write?
Well, things that a number of things were hard to write. I guess I tried to be as truthful as I could, and this was one of the things that I had to do was read books about how to write good fiction, because I'm an engineer. I don't really have a lot of background in creative writing. One of the things I remember in a book by Stephen King, who wrote his memoir about how to write good fiction. He said, if you're going to write good fiction, you've got to be completely honest. And I thought, well, that doesn't really make sense. But what he meant, or when he explained it, he said, well, you've got to have this character. You've got to really understand their personality. Then you put them into a difficult situation, and you imagine how they would react. And then you put that in exactly how you see it. Even if you don't like it, you think, I'd rather they did something else. You've got to be honest in how you think that person would react in that situation. And so I tried to put myself in the shoes of each of the characters when I'm looking through their eyes, and I try to think, well, how would I react? How would they react, given what I know about their personality, and I tried to be as honest about that as I could, I guess.
Yeah. Now that's particularly interesting. Do you think that having researched this and having seen a whole new side of it, that us Aussies and Kiwis out there, that we really truly have an understanding of the Gallipoli campaign, or is there a lot more education to be done?
Well, I think I would love for Australians and New Zealanders to have a better understanding of the campaign broadly, and thinking of it from the Turkish perspective as well, and not see it as just the Allied campaign or the Anzac campaign, but it was a battle between multiple sides, and everyone was really doing what they needed to do for their own loyalties.
No, that's very fair. Were there any key takeaways that you took from writing the book?
Well, there's a quote that I've put in the front of the book, which I guess often came to my mind, which often people quote or misquote, by George Satiana. Which I'll probably misquote it now, but he said,
we're lucky you got the book in front of you, so you got a reference point.
He said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I guess when I look back at the way a lot of the decisions were made around World War I and the decision to send the Australians to Gallipoli, and the fact that after World War I, World War II started 20 years later, and I think it's such a sad part of the human condition that we make these decisions without really learning from things that have happened in the past, and often conflict occurs that could be avoided, and that's not just about wars. That's about, might be in a relationship with someone in your family, and a lot of people could probably think of a time when they've had the same argument more than once.
Oh yeah,
because we don't always, learn from mistakes. So that's, I guess, that's kind of a theme and something that people may take from it.
What were some of your favourite chapters that stood out for you?
I guess I really enjoyed looking at the thoughts that went on inside people's minds, particularly as they were making some of these big decisions that were going to have massive consequences, and thinking, well, why did that seem like the right decision at the time? Would I have made that same decision if I had that same information available to me? And looking at the young guys, the young Australian guys who were so red hot keen to sign up and join into a war that was on the other side of the world. And it's easy to look back and think, well, that was a stupid thing to do. But given the culture of the day and the reliance of Australia on the British Empire and this sort of loyalty that there was, it is understandable how they made those decisions. And I think it's important to try and see it through their eyes and think, well, what would that have been like?
I always remember asking my my grandfather, born after World War I, but years after, imminently after, and in that cultural perspective, that socio-cultural perspective, he always said we never viewed ourselves any differently. Like the concept, and this was what he said, when he was a child, the concept of being an Australian in the 1920s was very different to the concept of being an Australian now, which is we didn't view ourselves any differently. Like we were still British subjects. So even though we were Australian and born in Australia, we were still British subjects. So we were the same. There wasn't really anything that drew us apart. So in terms of fighting a war across the world, I definitely sympathise with it. It'd be the equivalent of responding to a call to support Queensland or WA. Yeah. Of course you would. You wouldn't think twice about it.
Look, I also really enjoyed looking into or some of the strategic and political sort of decisions, like you mentioned, the the German ambassador, and you know the British politics, and just how the Germans and the English were kind of making decisions about the war and trying to draw other people in, whether it was the British inviting Australia to send the troops, or the way that the Germans really manipulated Turkey to join into the war.
Talk us through this. I'm not familiar.
Well, I guess there's some complexities there, and I'll go into a lot more detail in the story to try and
so make sure you buy a copy.
Take the reader on that journey. So the Western Front was in a bit of a stalemate in trench warfare in France. Germany was pretty motivated to knock Russia out of the war. Russia was aligned with France and England, and Russia was very heavily dependent on this waterway, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, further upstream, if you like, which really provided the only warm water shipping access from Russia to the rest of the world. Other shipping access from around the northern parts freezes over in winter. And Russia was very heavily dependent on this particular shipping channel for a number of reasons, including getting ammunition,
of course,
from the Allies. So the Germans decided that if they could close this waterway and block the shipping channel, that they would basically starve Russia, isolate Russia from contact with the Allies, and starve Russia of ammunition and other supplies. And that logic was quite sound in a way. And the Dardanelles and at the southern end and the Bosphorus Strait up at Istanbul were on land controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which is modern day Turkey. And by getting Turkey to align with them in the war, then they were able to close the waterways. Now, to do that, the Ottoman Empire was in a state of, like I mentioned before, in a state of collapse on the back of a number of military defeats. Really was very reluctant to get involved in this war. Couldn't afford to get involved in the war, but the British were building a couple of warships for Turkey, and the Turkish people had donated money to pay for these warships, and the British government said, "Okay, well, we've built these two warships now, but we're not going to give them to you. We need them because we're at war." So this was a bit of a slap in the face for the Turks, and the Germans took advantage of that, and they said, "Well, what we can do is we could give you two warships, and or sell them, but I don't think any money really changed hands." But the Germans managed to sail two warships, get them past the Allied defences, and sailed them up through the Dardanelles and basically donated them to the Turkish Navy. But they were still manned by German sailors.
But under the command of the Turks?
Well, yeah, supposedly.
Allegedly.
Supposedly,
But
but they the Germans then managed to wreak havoc with these warships, particularly up in the Black Sea around some Russian harbour towns. And because they were flying the Turkish flag, then Russia and England and France all declared war on Turkey. So Turkey got drawn into the war.
Which I'm sure Russia was not unwilling to do.
No, I mean the Ottoman Empire, which sort of grew into modern day Turkey, had centuries of history of conflict with Russia. They were always competing for territory, and Russia certainly always had its eye on Istanbul or Constantinople, as they referred to it. And this waterway, which was so critical for Russian trade.
Yeah, I remember even in that kind of scramble for Afghanistan and Central Asia, where Russia was pushing south into that Central Asian area, and the Ottoman Empire was pushing east and north, and they would constantly come into conflict there. And of course, around the Balkans as well, where you had the very heavily Orthodox community and the nationalism of the 1800s. And I don't mean nationalism, post-World War I, but the liberal nationalism, say the Greek nationalism that you saw, or the German nationalism with the unification of Germany, that 1800s liberal style nationalism. And you had the growth of a lot of the Orthodox Balkan states pushing against the Ottomans with support of Russia and, of course, Crimea as well. So I could imagine that that Russia was quite willing to take that extra front on. It's a guess.
The Russians were struggling, and they actually called on England to provide some sort of demonstration.
Oh wow! So I'm wrong. Russia didn't necessarily.
Well, I think Russia was quite happy to be fighting against the Ottomans. They already were, in fact. The Turkish government had recently been overthrown in a military coup, and the movement, which is often referred to as the Young Turks, nationalistic Turkish, a lot of the military officers took over the Turkish government a couple of years before all this took place, and they, for whatever their own reasons, they launched their own attack against Russia in the Caucasus. And the Russia was actually sent a request to England to say, well, can you do something about the Turks? Can you do some sort of demonstration? Was the what it was described, and it was not very clear what that meant. But the English and the French were desperate to keep Russia in the war, because if Russia decided it was all too hard, made their own peace with Germany, then that would have freed up hundreds of thousands of German soldiers from the Eastern Front, and they could have all gone over to the Western Front, and that would have been all over. The Germany would have won. So England and France were desperate to keep Russia involved in the war. Russia had asked for help, and in the form of some sort of attack against Turkey, and England said, okay,
sure.
And Winston Churchill came up with this idea of using the Navy to blast their way through, and he was sort of actively involved in a lot of the strategic decisions about how to go about doing that.
So was the Gallipoli campaign part of that demonstration, that show of support?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it absolutely was.
That is
the reason why it took place, really.
So that is the exact culmination of what we're talking about. You cover. That's why you've got so many. How many characters did you say? You had 17.
There's 17 point of view characters. So each chapter is written from the point of view of one character.
Yeah.
And there's 17 different characters who each get a point of view throughout the story. Yeah. Some get more chapters than others. Some only get a small number, but some get quite a few. Yeah.
It is amazing to think that level of and I mean amazing is in just awe rather than amazing good, but how that maneuvering then filters down to the warship example and Germany exploiting it, and then an ongoing conflict with Russia and the Ottomans, concern that Russia might leave, then leads to thousands of Australian young men fighting in Turkey, and how it flows down.
That's right. The Australians volunteered to go and fight against Germany to defend the French against an invasion, and that was very much the basis that they signed up on. But when they did sign up, and they took an oath, and it was written down, and they signed it, and what they signed up for was to fight against the king's enemies. And there was no little asterisk that said, by the way, the king's enemies means Germany. It didn't say that on the paper. So they signed up to do basically whatever they were told. And but all the war posters and everything, all the propaganda was that they were off to fight against Germany and defend the French against this invasion. On the way from Australia to England, the first convoy, stopped in Egypt to
Very
train.
famous. Yep.
For a few months, and the only reason that they
That's
did
where you
that,
get the famous Sphinx photos where everyone's sitting on the Sphinx.
yeah,
isn't it?
that's right. So they weren't going to stop there, but in the end, the timing was such that the Australians would have landed in England at the start of winter, and that would have been horrible. There was no fighting; everything was a stalemate. They would have had to wait until everything thawed out for a spring offensive. So the decision was made to pause in Egypt and wait out the winter and just train in Egypt. While Australians were waiting in Egypt, still thinking they were on their way to go to France, all of those things that I just described happened.
Yeah.
And the British decided we need to send an expeditionary force down to the Dardanelles. The first attempt, which was just by the naval ships, was a complete failure.
Yes.
Many naval ships were sunk, and the naval ships were not able to get through the Dardanelles. So the decision was made to land an army force to try and take control of the Gallipoli Peninsula and silence the guns that could then let the Navy through. That was then the reason for the landings of soldiers at Gallipoli. But England couldn't afford a whole lot of spare soldiers because they were already in a stalemate.
Erstwhile engaged, yeah.
Their primary battlefield was in France.
Of course.
So they said, well, we can just send some, but how about we use those Australians and New Zealanders who are already in that kind of part of the world. They weren't probably valued as highly by the English as their own soldiers. So they said, well, we'll send some of them as well, and they can land there, take control of that peninsula, silence the guns, then we'll get our battleships through. So the idea was that was all going to happen fairly quickly. And that was the decision that was made probably in the month leading up to the Anzac Day landing.
Yep. So
the Australians really didn't know that they were on their way to Gallipoli until they were hitting the beach.
Oh, really? They thought they were going to Germany or France?
Well, when they left Egypt, they knew they were on their way to the Dardanelles.
Okay. Yep.
But that only took a few days.
No, of course. Now, that took you 7 years, that book. Do you have any other books next in the pipeline?
Look,
I don't know. You need to put your feet up.
No, I love the idea. I really do. I enjoyed the process very much. I need to find the right content, I think. Like the thing that really motivated me for this one was I had such a close personal family connection to both sides of the conflict. My wife's grandfather fought for the Turkish forces at Gallipoli against the Anzacs.
And you had a family connection as well?
Yeah, my great uncle was at Gallipoli. My great grandfather was on his way to Gallipoli, but ended up going from Egypt directly to France because the Gallipoli campaign was winding up at that stage.
Yep.
So yeah, our children have got the bloodline of both sides of the conflict.
The legacy.
I would have to think long and hard about what else would draw me in, but I really enjoyed the process, and I'd love the idea of doing something else. I've got a few ideas, but I haven't really moved on from the launch of this one just yet.
Well, you need to wait for your tap on the shoulder for a TV series. When's that going to happen? This is TV series bait. You've already got the 17 different perspectives.
Yeah, I'd love to think so. I don't know. I think certainly that idea has crossed my mind, and I love to speculate about it. I love to see Australian dramatised history on the screen. I think there's not enough of that
Come
sort
on,
of thing.
ABC, 1.3 billion a year. You can do this. Yeah, we can make a good series. Out of this.
I'm only just going through the launch of the book, I suppose. So that's I guess my focus at the minute. But I love the idea.
Now, look, I think that is all we have time for. Say thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Actually, before we wrap up, where can people get a copy of the book?
Look, it's in good bookshops. You can buy it directly from the publisher, New Holland Publishers. Also, you can find a link through my website, which Actually, I really did want to mention the website.
Give it a plug.
If you've got a few minutes, not just because it's a plug, but because when I wrote the book, I wrote a whole lot of end notes, and this comes back to the question about mixing fact and fiction. I really wanted it to read like a novel. I didn't want little numbers through there that sort of created distraction.
And that's fantastic, because I have a bugbear for it. And there are a few historians out there, fantastic writers, fantastic historians. But there are some times where the page is 50% bullet points or end notes. And it really does disrupt the flow.
It's a distraction.
Yeah.
So my primary objective was that this should read like a novel. I did write a whole lot of end notes because for any given chapter, I really wanted the reader to know, well, how much of this is based on a historical account and how much of this is stuff Tim just made up. And I wasn't able to put all those end notes at the back of the book due to publishing limitations. The book's already nearly 600 pages long. It's a solid read. All of the end notes I've put on my website. So anyone who reads the book has got free access, or anyone who doesn't read the book, anyone's got free access to the website. There's for every chapter in the book, there's a set of end notes where you could read what historical account did I refer to, what did it say. In some cases, it might be, this battalion fought on this hill on this day and this many people died, or it might be this person mentioned in their memoirs that they had this experience and it was really difficult and they felt this way about it. Yeah. So all of those things are there on my website. That's the primary reason.
If you're doing an HSE assignment, you've got a lot of footnotes there, a lot of sources. If you're doing a master's or an honours thesis or a PhD thesis, a lot of sources on Tim's website.
Yeah. And on the website there is also a link, to come back to your original question. I do have an eBay listing where I've got signed copies I'm selling directly. But
nice.
If you can find it at your local bookshop, then it'll save you the postage.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Tim, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks, Liam, for having me. It's been fun.
That was Tim Knight, author of Gallipoli Soup, a war story of statecraft and sacrifice. Go online, as Tim said, to his website, to the publisher, to all good bookstores. Go out, grab a copy while you're at it, and have a read of that. But that is all we have time for today on the Contested Ground podcast. But until next week, bye-bye.
The website is gallipolisoup.com.